Welcome to Law and Crime. I'm Judge Ashley Wilcott covering the afternoon trials for you today. Now, the third case that we've been covering live this week is Florida versus Nouman Raja. Now, this is the case. He's a police officer. He is accused with manslaughter and first-degree attempted murder, which is an interesting charge out of the state of Florida. There you see the defendant in the case. The victim was Corey Jones, a 31-year-old man. And the worst part is, if there's a worst part in any murder case, that he was a stranded motorist when he was shot. He was not engaged in criminal activity, and he was not on somebody else's property or doing something that he should not have been doing. He was shot and killed. There were 6 shots fired, 3 of which wounded him. One of the shots to the chest was the fatal wound. So we are covering that case live. Now, having said that, they are on a lunch break. So what I want to do before I bring on our legal analyst to really look at this case in depth is to play for you an FBI reenactment. Now, this is going to be interesting because you have 3 different types of videos. The stranded motorist, the victim, Corey Jones, called 911. The defendant in this case, he didn't call 911, I apologize. He called roadside assistance. The defendant in the case after the shooting did call 911. So we're going to reenact and hear all of the different video calls that, audio of the calls that were going on. Let's listen.
Stop. I'm good. I'm good. Yeah. Get your fucking hands up. Get your fucking hands up. Go.
Oh my gosh. There's gunshots.
Get that fucking gun right now!
911.
Hey, this is Gardens Alpha 1. I just got one down. I just shot one person. I'm at that off-ramp right behind Doubletree. Blackmail.
You're behind the Doubletree?
I'm on the off-ramp, 95 southbound off-ramp, off the Doubletree. I am not covered in anything right now. And,
all right.
Give me some units. I got one down. I got one man down. I got 5 ready. Stand by.
Roger, you all right?
Yeah, man, I'm good. Drop the gun!
On the off-ramp, right?
On the off-ramp. Give me some units. I've lost contact with him. I don't know where he is.
All right, you got it, buddy. Where's your radio? Where's your radio, Raj?
My radio's in the van right now. I don't have it with me. That's why I'm on the phone.
All right, stay on the phone, buddy. What's the guy look like?
Black male wearing all black dress, had a silver handgun in his right hand. I came out, I saw him come out with a handgun, I gave him commands, I identified myself, and he turned, pointed the gun at me, started running, I shot him. I've lost contact, 65 to 28 on the SUV.
Go ahead.
It's going to be a Florida 28 of 286 Papa Romeo Hotel, 286 PRH.
Don't know yet. Spike, put that out now. All right, it's a 08 Hyundai 286 Papa Romeo Hotel.
Yes, 286.
All right, it's coming back. It's coming back on a 4-door Hyundai gray.
Yeah, SUV.
Yeah, it's out of Lake Worth. It's not stolen or anything.
All right, man.
All right, stay on the phone. Where's the van at? Where's your van at? In the Doubletree lot?
No, right on the off-ramp. You'll see my van right there. I'm walking back to my van. I'm back to my van in the car. All right. Hit at least 3 to 4 times.
All units, signal 33.
All right, you got your radio now?
Hotel.
No, hold on, not yet.
All right, I got units coming.
Mail and dreads on the off-ramp behind
All right, man,
Doubletree.
thank you.
All right, stay on the phone there, all right, buddy?
Temple. Send them where the mail went.
All right.
Gardens Alpha 1, I'm by the radio now.
26. Five mail hit 3 to 4 times. 51.
Right,
FD 51 stage. 350. We're in the parking lot.
I'm not in the parking lot. I'm right on the off-ramp. He ran across into the grass towards 95. Guys, right here. He ran in that direction. I lost visual of him. 348. I'm on 95. Just advised that they went on.
All right, so again, that's a reenactment done by the FBI, and you did hear one of the things was the stranded motorist, the victim's call as a stranded motorist. On the left side of your screen, that was the actual video of the 911 call made by the defendant after he shot. And then you also hear the police radio. So let me bring in my special guest today, Gene Rossi, former prosecutor. Always happy to have you as one of our legal analysts and host here on Law and Crime. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, good afternoon.
And then Vincent Hill, also one of our esteemed colleagues, hosts here and also investigator. And let me start with you, Vince. So what I'd like you to do is help break down and understand of that reenactment, what stands out to you the most as the most important piece of what you've heard?
Well, let me preface it, Ashley, by saying this. Of course, in policing, I know as a former law enforcement, things can escalate very, very quickly. But the fact that Corey Jones was the stranded motorist on the side of the road, and he's approached by an individual, Nouman Raja, in plain clothes, who he says in that 911 call, Ashley, identified myself. He said that in the 911 call. He said it in his video statement just 4 hours later. But we know from audio, he did not identify himself as a police officer. And the one thing I always preach and practice when I was in policing, especially when I was in plain clothes, never approach a citizen in an official capacity without some type of marking that says you're police, because they don't know you're the police. The responding officer may not know you're the police. So truthfully, Corey Jones was probably thinking, hey, I'm about to get robbed. Here's this guy in this undescript child molester van that's pulling up to me. I don't know what's going on. So I'm going to draw my gun. And quite frankly, I don't blame Corey Jones for doing that, because put in that same exact situation, I would have done the same thing. The only difference is me being trained in firearms, I probably would have shot Nouman Raja not knowing who he was.
Gene Rossi, let me ask you this. One of the defense arguments has been stand your ground, that this defendant police officer acted to defend himself from the victim in the case. Now, tie that in as prosecution with the fact that he did not, as Vincent just pointed out, he did not have any clothing on to identify himself as a police officer. How does that relate to the defense's argument that it should be a stand your ground defense?
Well, I think Vincent hit the nail on the head. This officer did everything outside of the book. Short of just, taking his life without even approaching. And Vincent's right. He had nothing on him to signify that he was a police officer. In fact, if you look at his attire, it probably would be hard to see at night. He doesn't look like a police officer at all, and that's the point. He was under surveillance. And I had a trial. I supervised a trial. It was a Park Police case in Virginia. And Vincent's point is well taken, because the defendant's argument in that trial, he got in a fight with 4 police officers and almost killed one of them. He didn't know they were police officers. Well, each of the officers testified that we had a garb that said police on it. And his defense didn't go anywhere. He was found guilty. So if I were in that car, if I were Corey Jones and I saw that van, and the defendant get out, I would have had my gun off of safety, ready to be used.
Yep.
Yeah, and so here's the other piece of that. One of the things they did in trial today is they actually did get out the clothing that belonged to the defendant. So the clothes that you see in that audio, they've already brought out in court, opened the bag, bring them out to say, these are the socks, pants, shirt that the defendant was wearing in this case. Clearly, there's nothing indicating he was police. And now, like you pointed out as well, the fact that there's an audio tells us so much in terms of the truth and what really happened. And he keeps saying, oh, yes, I identified myself as the police, but you're right. You pointed out that does not appear to be the case when you listen to the audio. We're going to need to take a quick break, but you are not going to want to miss coming back and joining us as we continue to analyze and watch these trials live here on Law and Crime. Welcome back to Law and Crime. I'm Judge Ashley Wilcott. So we heard some of the recordings, audios of the calls. Now let's watch the interview that the police, law enforcement actually had with the defendant, Nouman Raja, in this case.
And this is where I grabbed my phone and I started running after him with my gun still pointing in his direction, screaming. And I was on 911, I was yelling. I was like, drop the gun, drop the gun, drop the gun. And I was screaming at the top of my lungs.
What was he doing at that point?
He was running, and right when he got about, I think it was, because this is where I started to walk. I remember I was around that area by that pole when I decided to walk back to get my radio again, because this guy was like, go get your radio, Raj, go get your radio. And
just be careful right here.
I'm sorry. And I remember over here is where I was, and he must have been, do you see this plant right here? This big bush?
Clump?
Yeah, the big clump. Just where the ditch is right there in front of it, kind of like he was in that area, and that's when he did the spin. Then I was yelling, I was like, drop the gun, drop the gun. And I saw him go like this. And I remember saying to myself, aim. I still remember, and I was like, aim! And I put that front sight right in his center mass, and I squeezed. I believe 2 rounds.
Okay.
And I saw him drop, at which point, and when he dropped and everything, and I started going up, and I couldn't see him. And I was like, I lost sight of him, I lost sight of him. And they're like, go get your radio, go get your radio. And I started to go, and I was like, just pedaling back and everything. And the guys came, and I was like, look, I lost sight.
So remember, that video was taken right after that same morning that this incident occurred. Let me bring you in, Vincent. So we see that clearly he is geared up, wound up. Tell me your assessment as an expert investigator. Did he follow police procedure in this instance?
Well, you know what's funny? It would be funny if Corey Jones wasn't dead. You know, later in that video, Raja talked about, oh, I teach this, I preach this, because he was an instructor at one of the local colleges about police tactics. But he said in the beginning of that, I got caught with my pants down. I never should have pulled in front of the car like I did, because we should assume it's always occupied, which is true, because you know, no matter what you're doing in policing, you rely on your training and your muscle memory. So what I really think, Ashley, and although Raja says when he passed by, he couldn't tell if it was occupied, I think he saw Corey Jones inside that vehicle. He got overzealous. Oh, let me turn around and see what this guy is doing. And, well, I'm on this exit ramp, so I would have to circle around, so I'm just going to pull it in front of this vehicle. He did a very big no-no in policing. You never, ever, ever put yourself in front of a vehicle, which is essentially a 4,000-pound bullet, because let's say Corey Jones was up to something and he attempted to run Raja over. He put himself right in the line of fire, and that's something he shouldn't do. And he even said it himself, I got caught with my pants down. He absolutely did, because he was dead wrong.
So let me ask you this just quickly. What about the fact that he didn't call for backup? If you're not in police clothes and you see this, why would you just not call the police and say, hey, there's somebody in a car sitting on the side of the road. Can you all come check on it?
That's right. And actually, he even said that in that statement. He's like, hey, we were doing this burglary detail, and I was told if I see anything suspicious to call a marked unit, and if I need to assist. And it goes back to what I said. When you're in plain clothes, when you're working these special details, your job for that night is to look for burglary. It's not to look for broken down vehicles where you could have simply got on your radio and said, hey, there's an abandoned vehicle at this exit. Can you send a tow truck? He didn't have to approach Corey Jones. And I think that's going to be really crucial here. And as this case goes along, actually, he didn't even need to approach Corey Jones that night.
So, Gene Rossi, you are my expert litigator. As the defense, what are you going to argue to offset the fact that there might be testimony that, hey, listen, he did not follow police procedure. He was acting outside of his role of that?
Well, I'm going to try to argue the Jason Van Dyke defense, which didn't work very well. When police are confronted in a situation like this, and Vincent teaches this, your mind is moving at such a fast and a slow pace, and every millisecond looks different to a police officer than to the average citizen. So when he stopped and he pulled up, granted he wasn't wearing gear to identify. My first argument would be this: the AT&T roadside assistance tape doesn't have everything, members of the jury. It doesn't have what my client said as he got out of the van. It didn't pick it up. And that's reasonable doubt. He did, when he got out of the van, say, I identified myself. So that audio is not complete. That's the first argument I would make. May not go anywhere. Second is, when I approached the car, I was doing surveillance because we had a rash of auto thefts. And I honest to God thought, in good faith, that this was a car theft. And it was a car theft by a guy who could be armed. When he got out of the car, he had a gun. He pointed that gun at me. And with my police training, I had to act in a millisecond to defend myself. And then, sadly, he ran away, kept his gun, turned towards me, and members of the jury, I had to take 3 shots at his chest. And it's a horrible situation, but I had to defend myself.
All right, so now let's listen to the police supervisor. This is the police dispatch supervisor that testified, Brian Noss, and see what he had to say.
I put that information into the call notes to be broadcasted out to the other units.
Okay, and so that information goes, when you say other units, does that mean the police officers?
Responding police units.
Okay, so they would have gotten that information based on what he told you during the call?
Correct.
Now, you also asked him at some point, where was his radio? Do you recall hearing that?
Yes.
And why did you ask him that?
Because it was unusual for him to call on 911 when I know that he had a radio with him.
And you said you've been doing dispatch for 30 years?
Give or take, yes.
And in your 30 years of dispatch, had you ever had an experience where an officer involved in a shooting called you from his personal phone on 911?
No.
Now, he said to you that he's hit at least 3 to 4 times. Is that also true?
Yes.
Do you recall if you would have put that information out in your dispatch notes?
That was put into the call notes.
I said you had your tactical vest on, right?
And what was his response?
No, I didn't have it on, Sarge.
What did you do that time?
I sent him outside the crime scene with Sergeant Anderson, who's a PBA rep.
What is PBA, sir?
It's the Police Benevolence Association. It's the union for law enforcement. And a PBA rep acts as a liaison for an officer, in this case involved in an officer-involved shooting, and the union attorneys.
And so even though Sergeant Anderson was on scene as a law enforcement officer, he was also a union rep at that time and went with the defendant.
Yes.
And what was his role at that time?
Just to stand by with Officer Raja until attorneys arrived.
Attorneys from where?
The union, state attorney's office, sheriff's office shooting team.
And did you see the defendant earlier that evening at lineup?
I did.
What was he wearing at that time?
A full uniform.
Were you surprised to see him out of uniform when you arrived at PGA and 95?
I was. I had been gone for 2 weeks prior to this. It was only my second night back at work. I wasn't fully briefed on what his duties were, but seeing him in lineup in full uniform, I couldn't believe that he changed out of uniform at 3 whatever in the morning, 2:30 in the morning, for his shift ended at 6. So just to change for that short amount of time, I was surprised.
Vince Hill, let me ask you. First of all, testimony, they were surprised. That was the dispatch supervisor. Surprised the defendant had changed out of his clothes. The other thing that I think is unusual is that he made a 911 call on his cell phone. What do you think?
Right. Well, the fact is, actually, look, even while he's on this surveillance in this unmarked car, and that's still questionable because I watched this, and even said, why did he change out of uniform? So I don't even think he was supposed to be in plain clothes. But the fact is, when you're in plain clothes and you're riding around on the surveillance detail, you already have your vest on and your radio on, quite simply because when you jump out of a car, you're not going to have time. Hold on, Mr. Citizen, let me get my police vest and my radio so I can tell you I'm a police officer. So the fact that he didn't have it on, he's in plain clothes, his sergeant doesn't know why he's in plain clothes, you really have to question, what was Nouman Raja doing that night?
Mr. Rossi, if you were the prosecutor on this case and I'm the defense attorney, would I be able to come to you and say, listen, I want to talk to you about a possible plea deal because I want to see what's on the table. Given some of the facts and circumstances I've understood the state's going to prove, what would your response be?
First, I got to say, Vince's comments are awesome. But what I would say is this. As a prosecutor, I always want to get a guilty plea. And the reason is this. You have a finality to the case. You don't have to do an appeal. But I always listen to what the victims, the family of the deceased, what they want. I look at the litigation hazards, and I also look at what a judge is going to sentence. And I look at all those three things. And in this case, if the victims are willing, and I have a sentencing judge who would agree to an agreed sentence, I would offer a manslaughter plea, drop the attempted murder, declare victory, and move on. I would probably ask for maybe 30 years, an agreed sentence of 30 years, maybe 25, if the family agrees to that.
So let me ask you, in terms of trial skills techniques, are you as a prosecutor able to offer that deal during the course of the trial? And B, can a defendant choose to enter a plea during the course of a trial, or is it too late?
No. There are some prosecutors that say once the jury's sworn in, there's no plea. I don't take that view. I've had several cases in my 27 years where in midstream, I had a defendant through his counsel say he wants to plead guilty. And I always took that. One was, I can think of a memorable drug case where the defendant was just pitiful. I took a plea at the end of the second day. We had 1/3 day of trial. I always try to do that because you have resolution, you'll have a sentence, and you don't have to do an appeal.
Right. And I know as a judge, I hear cases where during the course of the trial, there's a change in the winds and they do want to enter a plea, and certainly they're allowed to do that. So while it might depend on the court, just for our viewers, that's a possibility. Is that going to happen in this case? We don't know. We'll have to wait. Stay tuned and watch. We're going to take a short break, but come right back on the other side to hear more about this very interesting case.